In the first lecture on Mahayana Buddhism, we talked about how the earlier sutras, which were written in Pali, are quite different from the ones that appear in the Mahayana tradition. It's not only the language, however, it's that the Buddha really traveled around from place to place, and he gave all these different discourses or lectures that eventually became the sutras. The monks in attendance would memorize the gist of what he said, and they would put it into a kind of format that would be easy to memorize orally, and they would recite it over and over again. And they did this for centuries before the text actually got written down. But the main point here is that they were real events that the Buddha really gave these talks at. When we look at the Mahayana sutras, it's not only that they're written in Sanskrit, but because they're written often by many different authors, they can be extremely large, but they're also a little fanciful. So it's a little less realistic. If you look at the image here, for example, you can see the Pure Land that's being talked about, and we'll be talking a lot more about it in this lecture. But the basic idea is that the landscape doesn't look very much like the world in which we live, right? And even those sutras where they are talking about our world, usually there are tens of thousands or even millions and uncountable numbers of all kinds of different beings in attendance, not just a small village where everyone came to listen to the Buddha talk. And when the Buddha preaches, that people are instantly enlightened and the earth shakes and, the firecrackers go off and all of that kind of stuff. So we have much more magnificent sutras in this tradition. So that's, one of the important differences. But we're going to talk a little bit more now about a second huge difference. And that is that in the earlier tradition, as we talked about before, it's really a self-power tradition. The Buddha is giving a discourse, he's teaching, he's telling you what you need to do in order to attain the state of awakening, but you have to do it for yourself. And when we come to the Mahayana tradition, we see the opening up of this idea of other power, that we can draw on the power of Buddhas and other beings called bodhisattvas to help us in our own journey, whether spiritually or even in mundane ways. So, for example, if we look at this little bit of text over here, we can see that it says, whoever copies or sponsors the copying of this sutra, right? So it's not, the key thing here is the dedication, even if you don't do it yourself. So you're not necessarily learning the key points yourself. You're paying somebody else, a monk, to copy this sutra for you. But it's the more faithful dedication that's the key point here. And then it says all the different things that will happen if you do that for this sutra. And we see the same thing in all of these other Mahayana sutras as well. They have a section where they talk about the benefits that will accrue to you if you recite the text, if you copy it, if you pay someone else to copy it, all of these different things. And so the first one is, it says, you will never descend into the realm of Yama, the underworld, where those who have not lived good lives on earth will suffer in hells, and they'll eventually get rid of their bad karma, and they'll be able to be reborn in some higher form. But obviously it's not pleasant to be born in hell. You've got these 4 celestial guardian kings who will follow you around everywhere and make sure that you're safe. So that's another kind of benefit you could get. You will potentially be reborn in Sukhavati, the Pure Land that we're about to start getting into in this lecture. And finally, it is worth noting this last one, you won't be reborn as a woman. I add that because it is important to note that there are some gender issues in Buddhism. But I also want to say that Buddhism, relatively speaking, is pretty impressive on the whole for the degree to which it is not terribly problematic in gender terms. In this case, you might say that something of the broader Indian culture and this idea that we looked at in the Hindu tradition of the kind of idea that if you didn't earn your way up high enough, then you might be reborn as a woman, which would not be as good a rebirth as a man. But we should also note that the Buddha allowed women to become nuns with not quite equal status as the monks, but fairly close, certainly in the sense that they were able to go out into the homeless life of the monastics and wander around and do pretty much all of the things that the monks did. There are some gender issues there as well in terms of the monks' status is a little higher than the nuns. But for the time, that's pretty impressive. And if you click that link of the Naga princess over here, you can get to a story from the Lotus Sutra, the first Mahayana Sutra, and one of the most influential sutras in the entire Buddhist tradition. And you can see the point of the story is that it's addressing the same issue that women are somehow potentially inferior to men, and you have this young serpent kind of princess. She's a magical being, but she's 9 or 10 years old, and she transforms herself before Shariputra's eyes, the person who is critical of the idea that she could be as accomplished as people are saying, and she transforms herself into a Buddha right in front of his eyes. And so the point of that, which is enshrined in this most important Lotus Sutra, is that the whole idea of being reborn as a man or a woman is rather insignificant, because in the end we all have the potential to become Buddhas, including women. And it's almost like, she transforms herself back into a princess, because it really doesn't matter whether she's a little girl or she's a Buddha, because essentially she is the Buddha, right? So we have some interesting gender issues. We might talk about them, but probably not. But it's certainly worth noting that where the tradition stands on gender. Generally speaking, better than most traditions for the ancient period. Now, I want to turn to the Pure Land, and I'm not going to read through the material, but the gist of the story is that there is a king, and he encounters a Buddha during his time on Earth, and he decides that he wants to pursue the same thing. And so rather than pursuing the Theravada path of trying to become an arhat, a follower of the Buddha who attains awakening, he decides to become a full Buddha. Now, in the earlier tradition, it's not really clear that there's a big difference in the status of enlightenment, but in the Mahayana tradition, they make a big deal of this, and they say that the enlightenment of an arhat is far inferior to that of a Buddha. But to become a Buddha takes a long time of dedication and practice. And so the idea is that Dharmakara, the king in question, he gives up his worldly power, and he embarks on a fabulously long journey as a bodhisattva, a being bound for awakening, and through billions and trillions and cajillions of years of training, he finally does attain his awakening. And when he does, he fulfills one of the vows that he said he would do if he ever became a Buddha, and that is to create a pure land, an ideal place where anybody who meets certain conditions will be able to be reborn in that pure land. We're going to talk a little bit more of how you get to the Pure Land, what happens in the Pure Land a little bit later. But for now, I just want to highlight the nature of the land itself. And here I'm not going to read it. I want you to read through this material. You can look at the images. It's clearly a wondrous place. And the gist of it is that if you are born in the Pure Land, there will be no suffering there. And remember, one of the key points the Buddha made was that for those who are not enlightened, life is characterized by the idea of suffering. There is no suffering in the Pure Land. So that's a pretty good start. And just to make matters even better, you are guaranteed to attain awakening, because the whole way that the Pure Land has been set up is that everything is conducive to your progressing towards Buddhahood as quickly as possible. It still might take a long time, but of course you're taking a long time in a fabulous place. And you can read the descriptions. So go and read through that material. I just want to leave you with this last couple questions here. I want you to think about, how does this compare to the Abrahamic conception of heaven? There's some obvious similarities and some differences as well. But also, I want you to think about why there may be such vivid descriptions presented in this sutra. We certainly do get some descriptions of what heaven might be like in the Abrahamic traditions. But in this case, and of course I've only excerpted bits of it, it goes on and on and on and describes in fabulous detail all these different aspects of the Pure Land. So I want you to think, why might the author have inserted such detail about the way that it looks and what's going on in the Pure Land? Why do we need so much detail? Think about that. We can talk about it in class, but I'm just going to say in the next mini lecture there is some information that is relevant. So you may want to start thinking about it now, and then you can continue to think about it as we go through the material in the next mini lecture, and hopefully you'll pick up on some of those clues, and then we can talk about it more in class.